Welcome back, everybody, to me talking from under my bed because it's been raining all day and now it's getting dark and I couldn't, there was a bit of time earlier today when I could have recorded, but I was busy because life's a bitch. Not even that, like, life sucks right now, and I have some financial issues that I really need to get a handle on, and that took a bit of, mental energy. And time. So if I'm a bit more confused than usual today, that's basically the reason why. I need to find money and I need to find it fast, and we'll see how that goes. But that's not exactly your problem. So let's actually go into the main theme of today, which is me talking about chapters 3, 4, and 5 of Orb, Sceptre, and Throne by Ian Cameron Esslemont, which is the middle part of Book 1, which is, called Orb. And if you have guesses on what will be the title of Book 2 and Book 3 of this novel, then I hope they're Sceptre and Throne, because that's what we're going to get into. Anyway, that's what we're going to talk about today. I'll try to keep it short because I have an important meeting right after this and still need to do other stuff. We'll see. Anyway, here we go. Let's do this. Cheers. All right. So, we kind of learn a lot of interesting things in this novel about all kinds of bits and pieces. One of them's obviously the main theme is kind of horror-ish, and we see in book one, like in today's chapters, we see a lot of continuation from what happened yesterday, or we spoke about yesterday. That is, we come back to the whole archaeological thing, and that's going to be something that we'll going into in a second. We have very little of the other, like very little of what's her name, Kiska and Leoman in this one, which continues the theme we spoke about yesterday. We have a bit more of the plot line of Ansi, and also get more of Picker, Blend, Duiker, and what's his name, Spindle, Mr. Hesher. So yeah, we're basically continuing from yesterday, not exactly introducing a lot of new plot lines. Although we have like another, point where we come back to a another fan favorite, or at least a favorite of mine, which is Torvald Nam. And we meet Cole. And so we're going to talk about that a bit as well. Now, let's start with the whole Eben excavation thing. And right, exactly what we spoke about yesterday, we find his dig being taken over by Humble Measure. We also learned that Humble Measure has not exactly monetary interests in the dig, but political ones. And this is, I feel like, I don't know how much time you spent with archaeology and associated sciences. The problem, however, is that with history, that history is oftentimes politicized and used for such means. One of those situations, for example, is that the late Saddam Hussein was very much in favor of archaeological digs in Iraq, because it gave him and his regime the chance to, support their countries, link their country to ancient Mesopotamian culture, and thus build their sort of secular nationalism on something historical, which, is something that we see a lot of. Like, authoritarian regimes are big when it comes to funding archaeological digs, because they always hope to find something that will link their current regime to some glorious past, and their current country to some glorious past. It's a nationalist thing. And obviously the problem that we have, as if we are archaeologists, or, well, I'm not an archaeologist, obviously, but if you are an archaeologist, or a historian, which I kind of am sometimes a bit, or anything like that, is that, well, while being, paid to dig up stuff that rich people display to their friends is reprehensible, but digging up stuff or writing history that will then be used for political uses means, and especially reprehensible ones like nationalism, is even more fucked up. But you face that dilemma that you, on the other hand, are sitting there. It's like, yeah, well, but if I don't accept the money, I can't actually go there and find out. So the science part is very. It's a tough situation. And we get shown this here. However, we don't see Eben actually having that dilemma, because apparently he's too naive to actually realize that until it's too late. And then it's too late in a really big way. So there is that to talk about for a beginning there. We'll see how all of that continues in the next couple of chapters, I guess, although Eben's part is pretty much over because he is now the slave of the tyrant, possibly the tyrant. Which brings us to another bit. And that other bit is obviously what actually happens down there in the tomb. And here we come to something that is almost Indiana Jones-like in a way. And before Indiana Jones, we have that. It's a pulp thing, basically. And that is archaeological horror. I don't know if you've ever read, and I hope you have at this point, read some pulp stories, whether it is your H.P. Lovecraft, who's not exactly a good writer, or your Robert E. Howard, who is a pretty good writer, or your Clark Ashton Smith, who's an exceptional writer, or others. There is a lot of adventure stories that are all about people digging up graves and finding something there that still lives and does terrible things to you. It's also kind of fueled by the whole idea of the curse of the pharaohs and all that bit of horror in there. It's mostly I would say it's kind of linked to the fact that at least some people realize that going to other countries and digging up their cultures and taking all the good stuff to display it in their own museums and never even think about asking the Egyptians whether they cared what you did to their mummies or not. That there is some deep-seated knowledge that we understand that it's morally wrong to steal all their shit, right? It kind of is there, and we're sort of aware of that, even though outwardly, at least in the early 20th century, we're like, yeah, fuck that. We're the British, we can do that. Or, well, we're the Germans, we can do that. So forth. Which is why we have still some Egyptian stuff lying around in museums in Germany. Or the Gates of Ishtar in Berlin, which is, if you get a chance, go and look at them because they're fucking amazing. Point is, however, that with going to other continents and stealing all their archaeological treasures comes that deep-seated fear that maybe at some point something will retaliate. That's where the archaeological horror comes from. It's on the one hand, the overall cultural background that we have, there's digging up graves is probably not good. We shouldn't do that. There's a taboo, even in our culture, on digging up graves for most people, I guess, which is connected to the overall taboo of death and how we deal with the dead, which is something that we as a modern Western culture have serious issues with, to put it mildly. Point is, we're aware of that. There is something not quite right and not quite okay with digging up graves, even more so when it comes to digging up graves somewhere else. And that's where horror sinks in, because where this kind of horror works, which is basically a supernatural punishment for our very, very real and natural sins or mistakes. It's the revenge, the supernatural revenge element is a huge thing in some parts of horror. It's not all kind of horror, but it certainly exists in some parts of horror. You connect that in a way with what Lovecraft does when he goes into cosmic horror. And it's yeah, you know what? Maybe we dig somewhere, we find something that is just too big for us to understand, and it will blast our sanity, and so forth, which happens, Sanity is blasted on a regular basis in Lovecraft stories, but not only there. So that's sort of where the idea of archaeological horror comes from, which is a tradition. And We see that, as I said, in like 1930s stories. We kind of see it in some of the Indiana Jones movies, which built a lot on the 1930s pulp adventure story in the way they're built. So yeah, we expect if someone goes into a tomb to pick up stuff there, for whatever reasons, whether it's just to take all their stuff and sell it, display it in a museum or whatnot, or whether it is for proper archaeological research reasons, where you're like, yeah, I'm going to look at everything and then I'll just leave everything down there, you kind of feel that it's morally wrong. And that's why you're afraid that something might just happen. And that's what that whole thing is built on. And Cam Esslemont goes and just does the same thing. However, because he knows how archaeology works, he makes the grave robbing, well, not grave robbing, but Ebbin's work before that actually scientific and adds a lot of more like technical details, whereas like, your 1930s archaeologists will just use dynamite and a pickaxe to get to where they're going, and then they open the pyramid, find Tutankhamun, and then all die in horrible ways. This time around, they also use just a small pick and other stuff, and do it the right way, and then they still all die in horrible ways because, don't fuck with the dead. There's a prohibition against that. And sometimes the dead fuck you right back in not a good way. So yeah, it's just like well executed, playing on those well-established patterns of archaeological horror in pulp stories, just with a lot more like realistic detail from someone who knows how archaeology works, which is really cool. Plus, we finally learn who our two hired guards are, because they're our good buddies, Scorch and Lev, who I've spoken about before in Toll the Hounds, who are sort of our comic gravediggers / guard / whatever comedic duo for slapstick and the likes that we have in the world. Now we get them from Esslemont's perspective, which is really basically the same. I mean, compared to some of the other characters where we can make out a huge difference in their depiction, depending on which author we're talking about, Scorch and Lev are Scorch and Lev, which, once again, I guess makes sense, because compared to some of the other characters, Scorch and Lev are fairly established archetypes within, well, not so much fantasy fiction, but more like general fiction, or even drama, or, all over the place in literature. So we just get a bit more of that. Another thing that we've seen before, and is going to continue, or it's made throughout the first 3 chapters, is another well-established horror theme, which is we have all these different signs, all these warning signs, these dark omens, and they're just basically ignored for all kinds of reasons. Some of them are greed, which is another well-established horror theme, where it's like the overtly greedy person doesn't actually see the danger coming up. The overtly rational person, who doesn't believe in magic or the supernatural, doesn't see the thing coming. The overtly proud and powerful person doesn't see that, which, once again, it's horror. It's very much about dealing with hubris and the fall after that. Or at least this part of horror. Those other parts that are, well, way different things and not exactly nice things. Not necessarily, at least. But so that's sort of what we have here. Anyway, they tamper with the grave, and that being with the gold mask. And the mask is the evil thing. Once again, like diabolical masks that have magical powers are not exactly a new theme, right? It's not that Esslemont came up with that. It's, however, something that has also a lot of basis in both horror movies, and cursed items in your role-playing games are also a big thing. It's like you put on that mask, you can never put it off, and suddenly the mask possesses you. Possessed items are a huge thing. So that's sort of what we get established here early on. And this I feel is important, because when we get here, compared to a lot of other forms of horror, and I would say that parts of Orb Scepter Throne are a horror novel, or different aspects of horror novels, because there's other stuff going on as well. It's where you know the opponent fairly early on, and you know even how the thing works. You just don't know its weakness yet, and we're gonna have like more or less sympathetic characters that will try to figure out how to deal with that seemingly, you know, immortal and hard to kill force of nature, and we'll see how that goes in the coming chapters. We also kind of get that idea that it is connected to a resurrection of a glorious past. Now, is that a hint towards or a nod towards Glenn Cook's Black Company and the idea of the resurrectionists who want to resurrect the domination? Possibly. I mean, the idea of like resurrecting a glorious past that has also not actually been that glorious, or that glory is actually pretty fucking brutal and not exactly, a different form of glory. Let's put it that way. It's not glorious. It was, there was a lot of splendor because it looked good, So we have that there, and we have our crew of people that bring back the evil, possibly tyrant of the Rujistan, and those are Tyre, the assassin girl, who, I guess we kind of know. I mean, we remember her from Return of the Crimson Guard, and I guess we kind of know that her mother is Vorkan. It's Hinter, the ghost, so he has an agenda, which, is nice. And then there is Eamon. Is it Eamon, the guy's name? The antiquity sellers, whatnot. Those are like the three that really want to get that shit back. They apparently also got the backing of Humble Measure for some reason, because Humble Measure is just an idiot. But we learned so before, so there's that. Now we'll see if we have one of those Sorcerer's Apprentice kind of things where we'll, like, later on through the story, we'll see that they chewed off more than they, they bit up more than they can chew, or got more than they bargained for, and will at some point realize their mistake and fall prey to that thing. We will see. At least someone like Tyre is certainly showing the arrogance of youth that will often be punished in horror stories. So we'll see how that goes in the coming chapters. But that's, I feel, sort of more or less all we can say about it right now, apart from the fact that apparently everyone's favorite alchemist, Baruch, is not just a human being, but is maybe one of those guardians. There have been more of them, or not actually guardians, but enslaved or henchmen, or whatever you want to call it, of the tyrant, when he's dragged against his will there, but suddenly he has claws and shit. So we'll see what happens with Baruch there. It's certainly an interesting thing to have one of the, definitely one of the most powerful characters in the Rujistan, but also one of the more sympathetic ones being turned or enslaved against his will. Well, technically every enslavement is against someone's will. That's kind of the point of enslavement, right? But yeah, that's how that will work out. Well, we will see how that will work out in the next chapters. Yeah. So, let's look at the next bit. The Council. Torvald Nam, everyone's favorite alcoholic Cole, who seems to be a drunkard again, who knows, or at least pretends to be a drunkard at this point. I mean, we kind of know that he was an alcoholic in Garden of the Moon, and then gave it up, and then halfway, near the end of Toll the Hound, decided to drink again, because, for the death of Marillion and so forth. Now he smells of alcohol, but he's kind of hinted that he's not exactly drunk, but just smells that way. We'll see how that continues. However, what is more important is that even, that we once again come to a well-established theme in Malazan world-building storytelling, and that well-established theme is the issues with democracy, or not necessarily democracy, the issues with a council of noblemen, so it's basically aristocracy. Because the way the council is described is once again as it's ridiculous, right? The people there up there in the council or have no idea how things are actually going down in the city, and they are thus very much, embroiled in their very own power games in a way that are, I'm looking for a word that I can't find. They're very much defined by their distance from the actual problems and the actual people. We see that once again through the outsider. And I feel that's another thing that we're going to have here a couple of times that I wanted to point out for a second there, which I think is really clever. And it's something that Cam Esslemont has done a couple of times, and I understand why, and I appreciate why. So yeah, Torvald Nom is made counselor for House Nom because Vorkan has to hide from presumably the same fate that also befell Baruch, I guess. So we'll see how that goes. But Torvald Nom goes there, he has no idea of anything, and we can see the whole thing through his outsider's eyes that are fairly cynical, because he is very much a man of the street, or a person of, like, well, I mean, we kind of know where he's always been, what kind of adventures he's had. So he has a very different outlook on life than most of the rich noblemen in Daruzhistan. And I guess we'll see more of that in the coming chapters. For now, we just have like a display of the arrogance that comes with perceived power, which may or may not be real power. Plus, we have the idea of Jeshen Lim being, sort of another cat's paw of Tyre, as we've, kind of heard about that before, but now we actually see it in play. Now, the other outsider, and that's another thing that I wanted to talk about for a second here, is Jess, the new serving person in the Phoenix Inn. And I feel this one is really well done and understandable because she's a new person. And it's constantly mentioned that she's a new person. And that allows Cam Esslemont to use one of the fundamental settings, one of the fundamental set pieces of the Malazan world that was first introduced and plays a major role in 2 novels of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, that being Gardens of the Moon, and Toll the Hounds. He can use that specific set, that being obviously the Phoenix Inn, which, as we know, was originally planned to play an even bigger role in specific Malazan film scripts and shit like that. So that place, he can use that otherwise, like, all the Stephen Erickson fundamentalists will go and scream that he describes it wrong or whatever. He can just go ahead and just do with it what he wants, which, he has every fucking right to, because he probably invented the damn thing in the first place. He can just use that and portray it through the eyes of that new person, in this case Jess, and everything that is different or feels different from Toll the Hounds and Garden of the Moon is then just attributed to her being new and still having to understand how the whole, how those people behave and whatnot. So she doesn't understand why Krupp can actually sit there all the time and be Krupp, and is still worried about him ever paying his tab, which I guess we may find out why he hasn't or doesn't have to. We'll see. I just felt that this is, in general, a very smart move to make from a narrative point of view, to talk about specific, well-beloved or fundamental aspects of a shared world, is just to look at it through the eyes of an outsider. So you can do that, you can portray things that other people have portrayed in a new way and just blame it on the fact that this is a new person that you're talking about, like a different person. We kind of have a bit of that going on with Kiska in Knight of Knives, but not that much, because Knight of Knives is it has a very different structure. Anyway, that's just like a small thing that I wanted to talk about because I found it interesting from like a writing kind of point of view here. And now, let's talk about Ansi. Now, Ansi and Orchid, the girl who may or may not be a healer, and other people have formed that most valuable thing of a fantasy story, which is an adventure party. Well, it's not called that here, but basically they have Orchid and Antsy have been hired by Malachi, who's mysterious and dark and whatnot, to accompany him on what will basically be a dungeon crawl out there in one of the fallen bits of Moonspawn. And on their way out there, they even encounter the nobleman again, whose name I already have forgotten, but he's a brother to Jeshan Lim. He's part of House Lim. I just forgot his name. I want to call him Corvin, but that's not true. He's some other name, but sounds similar. Anyway, point is, we now have that group. There's two things that happen here, and we'll talk about that again in the future. But basically, we have our adventure group. We have the veteran fighter, that being Antsy, obviously. We have what you might call the rogue, or like a rogue type of person, or assassin, that is Malachi. We have the healer, priestess, whatever you want to call her, that is Orchid. And we have the nobleman, who may be a bard because he's super, nice. He may be something like that right now, in like role-playing terms. That's like how I would stat them up, basically. Make him a bard, maybe, or another fighter, but more like a nobleman fighter, whatever kind of person. That's sort of roughly how I would do it. And they set out to something where they crawl through tunnels to find treasures and loot them. And I feel now we know that the Malazan world has been built as a role-playing game setting for a long time. So this is interesting because it's one of the first times that we have like a very straight up thing that looks like very straight up like an adventure that could just be played that way, straight up on the table, which is like you have your group of adventurers, you go out to the spawns, you go out to Moonspawn, you loot the fallen down Sky Fortress. Fuck yeah. You have your characters, because this is like an experience group, you have some character tensions there already, which, is interesting, and so forth. But we also have other elements in here that help us understand a few things. One of them is you are shipped out there, no one has come back yet. So there's also like a survival element there. It's not like how much shit can you get out of the dungeon, it's more like, will you actually survive the dungeon? Which kind of makes it a bit darker. Now, are there other media types over the decades, over the centuries, where people are sent to a place and the question is not will they find something there, but will they actually survive? Will they actually survive? Is there a competition going on there? Are there different groups fighting each other on that island? Who knows? We will find out in the coming chapters. But, and this is the other bit here that I find interesting, is like the dungeon crawl, by definition, is once again another form of horror. It's more your survival horror. Because whether you're a group of people that are sent sent down someplace to loot a grave, or you're a group of people that are, for some reason, stranded in the middle of nature and face unknown dangers, and suddenly all your personal, interpersonal conflicts are breaking open, and the quest and all the paranoia runs high and rampant. It's like, who's whom here, and who can I trust, and so forth. Those two things can come together, and while you can play your dungeon crawl straight up as an adventure, or like a horror, like a supernatural horror, and you're like afraid of all the monsters that can jump out at you, you can also play it as a survival horror. And Cam Esslemont cleverly sets up the whole plotline here with I always want to say Dancer because I am really stupid, but I mean Antsy. With Antsy, who is far less funny here than he is anywhere else. We even get an explanation of that, and I'm going to go into that in a second because I first should finish this sentence, which is already running on way too long. What I mean is the following. He sets up the whole thing as a survival horror because right up from the beginning you have that mistrust of their employee Malachi, or whatever, something Malachi-like. You have the guy who enters later on, which is the nobleman. You have the person who knows way more than she should know about the Teist Andy, which is Orchid. And you have your paranoid veteran with way too much firepower. Now, will he go and take his machine gun and shoot aliens later on? I have my doubts, but we never know. Point is, however, let's go back to the Ansi thing. Now, Ansi, as I said in Memories of Ice, we never see him from the inside, and same in Tor the Hounds. You always see him through the eyes of Blend or Picker or someone else who are making fun of his paranoia and so forth. He's something of a laughing stock, a comic relief, almost a slapstick character. We assume he's very, very powerful, well, at least has survived until now, so he's very competent. But we never see that actually happening in the books. Now, this time around, we see him being competent, being brutal, being paranoid. We have that very small bit about his inner philosophy, which is like the world is out to get you. It's just a question for how long you can actually stay alive, and how you can obviously, make that a very paranoid philosophy from his point of view. And that's another thing that we have to understand here, right? He's a veteran. He's a veteran of wars, of all the stuff that's going on inside the ranks of the military. I mean, he's a bridge burner. There were definitely attempts to kill off the bridge burners. Whether those were smart or not is a different question, but that shit happened. So his paranoia is kind of justified. It just went way over compared to some of the other characters, to some of his comrades. So to see that from the inside and see how he's working makes him a lot more understandable, a lot more sympathetic as a character, and I do like that a lot. All right, which other things should we talk about before we end this for today? Kiska and Leomund. We continue our theme there that I spoke about yesterday, that being the idea that demons, because they're the other, are enslaved, and so which makes it so much easier to enslave them and so forth. And we continue that whole thing by having the demons let Kiska and Leomund go free, because they're like, we're not like you fucking humans, which is really cool. And that's kind of all there is to it right now, because we don't get much more of Kiska and Leomund yet. They're looking for that other person whose name I've forgotten, is Farouj or something like that. Anyway, we'll see where that is going. We also finally get the full connection between the Segula and Darujhistan, because apparently the Segula are called by the tyrant of Darujhistan. So we have 1,000 or 2,000 Segula coming cross country towards Darujhistan, which will certainly be interesting in the upcoming chapters. There's a bit of general stuff going on in Darujhistan that I'll come back to in a bit, which, tomorrow, but until then, I don't think there's enough there yet to actually talk about at some length, so I'll just cut it at this for today. As I said, I have enough other shit to do, and, find money, which is hard enough these days. Anyway, thanks for listening, watching, whatever. If you enjoyed this, subscribe. I don't know, tell your friends about this channel. We're 7 subscribers away from the magical 666 subscribers number, and I'll do a special video on heavy metal and fantasy literature when we reach those 666 subscribers. So maybe that'll happen next week. We will see. Anyway, until then, have a great Wednesday. Talk to you tomorrow. Cheers.